The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing through the Midwest frontier where snow buried dreams as easily as it did footprints. In the winter of 1888, a small town clung to survival, its wooden streets ruled by biting cold and an even harsher moral code. Whispers cut sharper than the frost, slicing through the heart of Grace Hamilton, a young woman whose every step was judged by eyes hidden behind frosted windows. Her father's trading post, a lifeline for the town, doubled as a den of gossip, where men's laughter and clinking glasses drowned out her silent hopes. Yet, in the shadow of a blizzard, fate would bind her to Caleb Mason, a solitary man scarred by fire and loss, in a way neither could foresee. A single night in his cabin would spark a scandal, chaining their lives together under the weight of duty and defiance. Through storms, wolves, and the unrelenting gaze of their neighbors, they would forge a path where love might bloom, or wither. Could two broken souls find salvation in each other, or would the frontier's cruelty claim them both? Grace Hamilton's hands trembled as she stacked sacks of flour behind the counter, the coarse burlap scratching her palms. The trading post was alive with the hum of commerce and judgment, its wooden walls creaking under the weight of a late November wind. Barrels of nails and bolts of calico lined the aisles, but it was the liquor in the back room that drew the crowd, and the scorn. The clink of glasses and bursts of laughter from the bar drifted through the thin partition, each sound a reminder of the shadow cast over her reputation. At 22, Grace was no stranger to the town's whispers, but today they stung deeper, like needles piercing her skin. That Hamilton girl, a voice had sneered yesterday, not the kind you'd bring home to your mother. She tightened her grip on the sack, her knuckles whitening, and forced her gaze to the frosted window, where snow swirled in frantic spirals. Her father, John Hamilton, stood at the far end of the counter, tallying figures in a ledger. His graying beard framed a face etched with worry, though he rarely spoke of it. The trading post was their livelihood, but its bar was a lightning rod for the town's moral outrage, and Grace, by association, bore the brunt. She was no barmaid, yet the townsfolk saw what they wanted. A woman tainted by the sins of rough men. Her dreams of becoming a teacher, of standing before a classroom with chalk-dusted hands, felt as distant as spring in this endless winter. She had found an old primer in the storeroom last week, its pages yellowed but brimming with promise. Late at night, she'd traced the words under candlelight, imagining a life beyond these walls, but her father's voice always pulled her back. "The store needs you, Grace," he'd say, his tone heavy with expectation. The door swung open, admitting a gust of icy air and Mrs. Margaret Wheeler, the preacher's wife, whose presence was as chilling as the storm outside. Her black bonnet framed a face sharp with disapproval, her eyes narrowing as they landed on Grace. Behind her trailed two women, their cloaks dusted with snow, their whispers already forming like frost on glass. "Good day, Mr. Hamilton," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice clipped, ignoring Grace entirely. "I trust you've considered the church's concerns about certain activities here." Her gaze flicked toward the bar where a man's laugh rang out, coarse and unyielding. John's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "We're doing what we can, Mrs. Wheeler. Times are hard." His words were measured, but Grace saw the strain in his eyes. The trading post was a lifeline, but its profits came at a cost, and she was the one who paid it. Mrs. Margaret's lips pursed, her voice dropping to a venomous hush. "A respectable woman shouldn't be near such vice, Mr. Hamilton. It's unbecoming." The words were aimed at Grace, each syllable a blade. She felt her cheeks burn, her hands clenching the counter's edge. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the weight of those eyes, Mrs. Margaret's, her followers, the town's, held her silent. Sarah, her childhood friend, slipped in behind the group, her freckled face half hidden by a scarf. She caught Grace's eye, offering a fleeting smile, but it faltered under Mrs. Margaret's shadow. Sarah had always been kind, but her support was cautious, confined to stolen moments away from the town's scrutiny. "Grace," Sarah whispered, edging closer as Mrs. Margaret turned to inspect a bolt of fabric. "Don't mind her, she's just—" "Sarah, come along," Mrs. Margaret snapped, her voice slicing through the air. Sarah flinched, her shoulders hunching, and followed without another word. Grace's throat tightened, the sting of isolation sharper than the cold. She turned back to the flour sacks, her movements mechanical, but inside a storm was brewing. The primer's pages flashed in her mind, each word a beacon of a life she could barely touch. She didn't know how, but she needed to escape. Not just the store, but the suffocating weight of this town. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, as if daring her to step into its embrace. The wind was a living thing, a beast that clawed at Grace Hamilton's cloak as she stumbled through the snow, each step a defiance against the storm's hunger. The world had dissolved into a white abyss, the town's lanterns long swallowed by the blizzard's maw. Her boots sank deep, the cold seeping through leather to numb her toes, but she pressed on, driven by a fury that burned hotter than the frost. The trading post's walls had closed in too tightly, the whispers of Mrs. Margaret and her flock echoing like a hymn of condemnation. Grace's breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the air like fleeting ghosts. As she clutched her scarf tighter, she didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay, couldn't face another day of eyes that stripped her bare. The primer's pages flickered in her mind, their promise of a classroom, now a cruel taunt, buried beneath the weight of her father's expectations and the town's scorn. The snow fell thicker, a curtain that erased the world. Grace's ankle throbbed from a misstep, her skirts heavy with ice. She turned to retrace her path, but the wind had devoured her footprints, leaving only a featureless expanse. Panic crept in, sharp as a blade, as she realized she was lost. The cold was no longer just outside, it was inside her, curling around her bones, whispering surrender. She stumbled over a hidden root, her hands plunging into the snow, and the world tilted. A thin layer of ice cracked beneath her, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. She scrambled back, her heart pounding, but the creek's edge held, its frozen surface glinting like a predator's eye. Her ankle twisted, pain shooting through her leg, and she bit back a cry. Each step became a battle, her strength leaking away with every gust. She fell again, the snow cradling her like a grave. Her fingers clawed at the ground, but the cold was winning, its fingers tightening around her heart. The primer's words swam before her eyes, geography, arithmetic, poetry, each a lifeline slipping from her grasp. She thought of her father, his weary face bent over the ledger, and Sarah, her smile fading under Mrs. Margaret's shadow. They would mourn her, perhaps, but the town would move on, her name just another whisper in the wind. Her eyes fluttered shut, the storm's howl fading to a distant lullaby. Miles away, Caleb Mason stood by his cabin's fire, the flames casting shadows on walls that had long known silence. The wind rattled the shutters, a relentless intruder, but it was another sound that made him pause. A faint cry, sharp and human, carried on the storm's breath. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the night, but the cry came again, piercing the solitude he'd built like a fortress. His hand tightened on the poker, the fire's glow reflecting in his eyes, haunted by memories of another night, another scream. The hovel had burned, his parents and sister trapped inside, their voices swallowed by the roar of flames. He had run then, too late, the heat searing his lungs, the guilt branding his soul. He couldn't save them, but this cry, this voice, was still alive. He grabbed his coat and lantern, the door slamming behind him as he plunged into the storm. The cold bit through his wool, the snow blinding, but he moved with a hunter's instinct, his boots crunching through drifts. The lantern's light danced weakly, a frail shield against the darkness as he scanned the ground. The cry grew fainter, a thread unraveling, and he quickened his pace, his breath harsh in his throat. There, a shape in the snow, crumpled and still, like a bird fallen from the sky. He knelt, brushing snow from her face, revealing pale skin and lips tinged blue. She was young, her features delicate but fierce, even in unconsciousness, alive, barely. Caleb lifted her, her weight slight but heavy with urgency. The wind fought him, pushing back like a living force, but he trudged toward the cabin, his muscles burning. His boots slipped on icy patches, the lantern swinging wildly, but he didn't stop. The fire had taken everything once. He wouldn't let the snow claim this stranger. The cabin's outline emerged through the blizzard, a beacon of stubborn warmth. He kicked the door open, laying her by the fire, her cloak sodden and heavy. He wrapped her in blankets, rubbing her frozen hands, his voice low and urgent. "Stay with me." The words were for her, but they echoed in his own heart, stirring something he'd buried long ago. As the fire crackled, casting her face in gold, Caleb sat back, exhaustion etched into his bones, and wondered what fate had brought to his door. Warmth was the first thing Grace Hamilton felt, a gentle tide pulling her back from the abyss. It seeped into her fingers, her cheeks, chasing away the cold that had clung to her like a second skin. Her eyes fluttered open, the world a blur of amber and shadow, and for a moment she thought she was home, curled by the trading post's hearth. But the air smelled of pine and smoke, not flour and whiskey, and the ceiling above was rough-hewn timber, not the familiar plaster of her father's store. A fire crackled nearby, its light dancing on walls that seemed to lean inward, as if guarding secrets. She lay on a pallet of blankets, her cloak draped over a chair still damp from the snow. Her ankle throbbed, a dull reminder of the creek's betrayal, and her heart lurched as the truth crashed over her. She was not home. She was in a stranger's cabin, alone, unchaperoned, her reputation hanging by a thread. She sat up too quickly, a wave of dizziness forcing her to grip the blanket. The room steadied, revealing a man across from her, his broad shoulders hunched as he stirred the fire. His face was half hidden in shadow, but his eyes caught the firelight, steady and unreadable, like a wolf watching from the forest's edge. He was older than her, perhaps 30, with a jaw shadowed by stubble and hands scarred by years of toil. Grace's breath caught, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of the night, the blizzard's howl, the ice cracking beneath her, the darkness swallowing her whole. This man had found her, carried her here, saved her. But at what cost? "You're awake," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. He set the poker aside, his movements deliberate, as if wary of startling her. "Thought you might not make it." He gestured to a tin mug on a rough table beside her, steam curling from its surface. "Drink, it'll help." Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the mug, the warmth of it grounding her. The liquid was bitter, some herbal brew, but it steadied her nerves. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely her own. "My cabin," he said simply, leaning back in his chair. "Few miles from town. You were half dead in the snow. Storm still raging, can't leave yet." His words were clipped, but there was no malice in them, only a quiet certainty that made her stomach twist. She glanced at the window, where snow piled against the glass, the wind's wail a constant reminder of her predicament. Alone with a man, no chaperone, no explanation that could shield her from the town's judgment. Mrs. Margaret's voice echoed in her mind, sharp as a blade. A respectable woman shouldn't be near such vice. What would she say now, finding Grace here? "I need to go," Grace said, her voice rising as she tried to stand. Pain shot through her ankle, forcing her back down with a gasp. The man shook his head, his expression unchanging. "Not in this storm. You'd be dead before you reached the ridge." He stood, towering over her, and for a moment, fear flickered in her chest. But his eyes held no threat, only a weary patience, as if he'd seen too much to be swayed by her panic. "Rest. You'll need your strength." Grace clutched the blanket tighter, her thoughts a tangle of fear and gratitude. She studied him, searching for answers in his weathered face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Caleb Mason," he said, turning back to the fire. "Just a hunter. Live out here alone." The words were simple, but they carried a weight she couldn't place, like stones sinking into a still pond. Alone, the word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken stories. Her gaze drifted to the cabin's sparse furnishings, a table, a single chair, a shelf with a few tin plates. On the shelf sat a small wooden box, its edges worn smooth, a faint burn mark marring its surface. Curiosity tugged at her, but she hesitated, the silence between them thick with tension. She wanted to ask about the box, about the scars on his hands, about why a man would choose this solitary life. But the weight of her own vulnerability held her back. Instead, she said, "Thank you for saving me." Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire as if it held answers he couldn't voice. "Get some sleep," he said, his tone softer now, almost gentle. "Storm will pass by morning." Grace lay back, the blanket rough against her skin, but her mind refused to quiet. The fire's glow painted the walls in shifting patterns, each flicker a reminder of the world waiting beyond these walls. A world that would judge her, condemn her, for this single night. She thought of her father's ledger, Sarah's hesitant smile, the primer's pages she might never touch again. And she thought of Caleb, a stranger who had pulled her from death's grasp, his silence louder than the storm outside. As her eyes grew heavy, the wind's howl seemed to whisper a question. What price would she pay for this refuge? The snow had softened to a gentle fall by dawn, its fury spent, leaving the world blanketed in silence. Grace Hamilton clung to Caleb Mason's arm as they trudged through the drifts, her ankle protesting with every step. His rifle hung over his shoulder, a quiet reassurance against the wilderness, but it offered no protection from the storm awaiting her in town. The air was sharp, slicing through her damp cloak, and her breath hung in fleeting clouds. Caleb's face was a mask of stoic resolve, his eyes scanning the horizon, but Grace felt the weight of his silence, as heavy as the snow beneath their boots. The cabin's warmth was a fading memory, replaced by the dread curling in her chest. She knew what awaited, whispers sharper than the wind, eyes that would brand her before she could speak. The trading post loomed in her mind, its walls no longer a refuge but a cage of judgment. The town emerged through the haze, its wooden rooftops dusted white, smoke curling from chimneys like tentative prayers. Grace's heart sank as they reached the main street, where figures moved in the early light, their heads turning, their murmurs rising like a tide. A woman paused with her basket, her gaze narrowing. A man unloading barrels straightened, his lips curling into a smirk. She stayed with him, a voice hissed, low but piercing, and Grace's cheeks burned despite the cold. Caleb's stride didn't falter, but his grip on her arm tightened, a silent anchor in the growing sea of scrutiny. They reached the trading post, its sign creaking in the breeze, and Grace braced herself as Caleb pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of flour and leather, but it was her father's face that stopped her cold. John Hamilton stood behind the counter, his ledger forgotten, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and fury. "Grace," he said, his voice trembling, "where have you been?" Before she could answer, his gaze shifted to Caleb, hardening. "And you? Who are you to bring my daughter back like this?" "Caleb Mason," Caleb said evenly, stepping forward. "Found her in the snow, half dead. Kept her alive." His words were steady, but Grace saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed at his sides. She wanted to explain, to spill the truth of the blizzard, the creek, the cold that had nearly claimed her, but the words caught in her throat as her father's expression darkened. The door opened again, admitting Mrs. Margaret Wheeler, her black bonnet framing a face carved from disapproval. Behind her, a small crowd gathered, their whispers a venomous hum. "Alone?" Mrs. Margaret said, her voice slicing through the room. "A night in a man's cabin, unchaperoned? This is an affront to decency." Her eyes locked on Grace, cold and unyielding, and Grace felt the weight of the town's judgment settle like a yoke. She opened her mouth to protest, but her father raised a hand, silencing her. "It doesn't matter what happened," John said, his voice low, strained. "People will believe what they want." He turned to Caleb, his gaze scrutinizing, as if searching for a flaw. "What kind of man lets this happen?" he asked, frustration lacing his words. "The kind who kept her alive," Caleb replied, his tone unyielding, though his eyes flickered with something softer, regret perhaps, or understanding. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on, until Mrs. Margaret stepped forward, her voice ringing with righteous indignation. "There is only one way to salvage this," she declared. "They must marry. Anything less is a stain on this town's soul." The crowd murmured agreement, their voices a chorus of condemnation. Grace's heart plummeted, her vision blurring. Marriage? To a stranger, a man she barely knew, whose scars and silence hinted at a past she couldn't fathom? She looked at Caleb, searching for a reaction, but his face was impassive, his eyes fixed on her father. John's shoulders slumped, defeat etching deeper lines into his face. "She's right," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's the only way." He met Grace's eyes, and for a moment she saw the father who had once carried her on his shoulders, now bowed by the town's will. "I'm sorry, Grace." "No," she whispered, but the word was lost in the clamor of voices. Caleb stepped closer, his presence steady despite the chaos. "If it saves your name," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, "we'll do it." There was no warmth in his words, but no resentment either, just a quiet resolve that made her chest ache. Before she could respond, the door swung open and Tom Larson strode in, his face flushed with anger. He was a blacksmith's son, broad-shouldered and handsome, who had once lingered at the counter with shy smiles Grace had never returned. "This is a mistake," he said, his eyes fixed on Grace. "You don't have to do this, Grace. There's another way." His words were a plea, but they carried a sting, a reminder of the life she might have had, now slipping further out of reach. Mrs. Margaret's voice cut through the tension. "Enough," she snapped. The church will hold a prayer meeting tonight to cleanse this sin. Be there, Miss Hamilton, or face the consequences. She swept out, the crowd trailing her, their whispers a wildfire spreading through the town. Grace stood frozen, Tom's gaze burning into her, her father's silence deafening. Caleb remained at her side, a stranger bound to her by fate's cruel hand. As the door closed, the wind howled outside, carrying the promise of a reckoning she could not escape. The church stood at the edge of town, its steeple a weathered sentinel against the gray sky, its walls groaning under the weight of a wind that carried no mercy. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old hymnals and wax, the pews filled with townsfolk whose faces were masks of curiosity and contempt. Grace Hamilton stood at the altar, her borrowed dress pinching at the waist, its faded lace a mockery of celebration. The fabric hung loose where it should have clung, a reminder of a life that no longer fit. Her hands trembled as she clutched a wilted bouquet of dried lavender, the only offering her father could muster in the haste of this forced union. Across from her, Caleb Mason shifted in a suit that had seen better days, its seams straining against his broad shoulders. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the preacher, but Grace caught the flicker of unease in his posture, a mirror to her own. The preacher's voice droned, a steady cadence that failed to warm the chill seeping through the floorboards. "Do you, Caleb Mason, take this woman?" The words blurred in Grace's ears, each syllable a link in a chain she hadn't chosen. She was 22, her dreams of chalkboards and children's laughter now buried beneath the town's verdict. Mrs. Margaret Wheeler sat in the front pew, her black bonnet a dark crown, her lips pursed as if tasting vinegar. Behind her the congregation whispered, their voices a low hum that stung like nettles. "A scandal," one said. "No better than she ought to be," hissed another. Grace's cheeks burned, her gaze dropping to the warped wooden floor, where dust gathered in the cracks like secrets. She stole a glance at Caleb, searching for something, anger, resignation, anything to anchor her in this surreal moment. His face was unreadable, but his hands clasped before him were steady, the scars on his knuckles pale against his skin. He had saved her from the snow, from death's cold embrace. Yet here they stood, bound by a town's decree rather than choice. The preacher turned to her, his eyes expectant. "Do you, Grace Hamilton, take this man?" Her throat tightened, the words she was meant to say lodged like stones. She thought of her father, his weary nod this morning, and Sarah, who had slipped into the church late, her freckled face half hidden by a scarf. Sarah had pressed a small package into Grace's hands before the ceremony, whispering, "For you, always." Grace hadn't opened it yet, but its weight in her pocket was a lifeline, a reminder of dreams not entirely lost. "I do," she said, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the silence. Caleb's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment the world narrowed to just them. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was something else, respect perhaps, or a shared defiance against the weight pressing down on them. He repeated the vow, his voice low and steady, and the preacher's final words sealed their fate. The congregation stirred, their whispers swelling, but Grace held Caleb's gaze, finding a strange comfort in its steadiness. His hand brushed hers as they turned to face the crowd, a touch so brief it might have been an accident, yet it grounded her, a spark in the cold. Mrs. Margaret rose, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Let us pray for their souls," she said, her tone dripping with righteousness. The congregation bowed their heads, but Grace felt their eyes, sharp as pins, even through closed lids. The prayer was a litany of judgment, each word a reminder of her fall. When it ended, the crowd dispersed quickly, their footsteps echoing like a retreating storm. Sarah lingered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She approached Grace, pressing the package tighter into her hands. "Open it later," she whispered, then fled before Mrs. Margaret could notice. Outside, the wind whipped through the churchyard, tugging at Grace's veil. Caleb stood beside her, his silence a wall she didn't know how to breach. She slipped her hand into her pocket, feeling the package's edges, and later, in the quiet of the wagon ride to Caleb's cabin, she unwrapped it. A primer, its cover worn but intact, its pages filled with the promise of lessons she might never teach. A note from Sarah was tucked inside. "Don't let them take this from you." Grace's eyes stung, her fingers tracing the words as the wagon jolted over frozen ruts. Caleb glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing, and the silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a life neither had chosen. As the cabin's outline appeared through the snow, Grace clutched the primer to her chest, a fragile shield against the unknown. The cabin was a world unto itself, a fragile fortress carved from pine and solitude, its walls trembling against the wind's relentless siege. Grace Hamilton stood by the single window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched snow drift in lazy spirals, blanketing the clearing outside. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of burning cedar, but the silence between her and Caleb Mason was colder than the frost. They moved around each other like strangers bound by an invisible thread, their footsteps careful, their words sparse. The marriage, barely 2 days old, hung over them like a storm cloud, its weight felt in every glance averted, every sentence left unfinished. Grace's fingers tightened around the broom she held, its bristles scraping the uneven floorboards, a futile attempt to impose order on a life that felt anything but. She had woken that first morning to find Caleb gone, his rifle missing from its peg, the fire banked low. He'd returned at dusk with a brace of rabbits, his face wind-burned, his silence unbroken. Grace had busied herself with small tasks, sweeping, scrubbing the tin plates, mending a tear in her cloak, each act a defiance against the despair gnawing at her heart. The primer Sarah had given her lay hidden beneath her palette, its pages a secret she guarded fiercely, a flicker of the teacher she might never become. She longed to open it, to lose herself in its lessons, but the cabin's confines and Caleb's quiet presence made such dreams feel like betrayal. Outside, she had found a patch of earth near the cabin's wall, sheltered by an overhang where the snow was thin. With a broken spade, she dug into the frozen ground, her hands aching as she carved out a small garden. It was a foolish hope, planting seeds in winter's grip, but the act steadied her, a promise to herself that she could still create, still grow. Caleb had watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, and said nothing. She wondered if he saw her efforts as futile, or if he, too, clung to scraps of hope in this unforgiving place. The days settled into a rhythm, fragile and unspoken. Caleb hunted or chopped wood, his absence a relief and a burden. Grace cooked what little they had, her hands learning the weight of the iron skillet, the rhythm of kneading dough. But the tension grew, fed by the scarcity that haunted them. Caleb's traps, set in the forest, came back empty more often than not, and Grace noticed the lines deepening around his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed when he thought she wasn't looking. She overheard him muttering one evening, his voice low and bitter, about Amos, a rival hunter who roamed these woods. "He's been at my traps," Caleb said, more to the fire than to her, and Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. One afternoon, as she tidied the shelf, her hand brushed the wooden box she'd seen that first night. It toppled, spilling its contents, a singed photograph, a rusted pocket knife, and a delicate handkerchief, its edges embroidered with tiny blue flowers. Grace froze, her heart pounding as she knelt to gather them. The photograph showed a family, their faces blurred by fire, but the handkerchief was untouched, its stitches fine and careful. She held it, her fingers tracing the flowers, and a wave of sorrow washed over her, not just for herself but for the man who kept such relics. Caleb's boots thudded on the threshold, and she turned, the handkerchief still in her hands. His face hardened, his eyes locking on the cloth, and for a moment, she thought he might snatch it away. "That's not yours," he said, his voice rough, but there was pain beneath it, raw and unguarded. "I'm sorry," Grace stammered, setting it back in the box. "I didn't mean it fell." She stood, her cheeks burning, but Caleb's gaze softened, his shoulders sagging as he crossed the room. He picked up the handkerchief, his fingers gentle, as if it might crumble. "My sisters," he said, the words heavy, like stones dropped into a still pond. "She was 14 when the fire took them. Ma, Pa, her. I wasn't fast enough." His voice broke, and he turned away, but not before Grace saw the glint of tears in his eyes. She stepped closer, her fear forgotten. "You couldn't have stopped it," she said softly, her hand hovering near his arm, not quite touching. "You did what you could." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had, a bridge across the chasm between them. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight, and placed the handkerchief back in the box. "Keep that garden going," he said, his voice steadier now. "It's something." He met her eyes, and for the first time, Grace saw not just a stranger, but a man carrying a weight as heavy as her own. As the fire crackled, casting their shadows on the walls, she felt a shift, small but undeniable. a seed of understanding taking root in the frozen ground of their marriage. The storm came without warning, a beast of ice and fury that descended on the cabin like a curse. The wind howled, no longer content to rattle the shutters but tearing at them, as if seeking entry to claim what warmth remained. Grace Hamilton woke to the sound of dripping water, a steady plink against the floorboards, and saw the roof sagging under a weight it could not bear. Ice coated the window in a crystalline shroud, the world beyond reduced to a gray blur. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, its light barely reaching the walls, and the cold seeped through every crack, curling around her like a predator. She pulled her shawl tighter, her breath visible in the dimness, and glanced at Caleb Mason, who was already at the door, his coat buttoned against the onslaught. His face was grim, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, and Grace knew this was no ordinary storm. "We need to brace the roof," he said, his voice cutting through the wind's wail. "It'll collapse if we don't—" He handed her a hammer, its handle worn smooth, and gestured to a pile of wooden planks by the wall. Grace hesitated, her hands unaccustomed to such tools, but the urgency in his eyes left no room for argument. She followed him outside, the cold hitting her like a fist, stealing her breath. The clearing was a battlefield of ice, the trees bowing under glittering weight, their branches snapping with sharp cracks that echoed like gunfire. The roof was a patchwork of frost and splintered wood, a gaping hole where the storm had clawed through. They worked in silence, their movements frantic yet precise, driven by the storm's relentless assault. Grace's fingers numbed as she held planks in place, her nails catching on rough edges, her skirts heavy with ice. Caleb hammered nails with steady blows, his breath clouding the air, but the wind fought them at every turn, flinging snow into their faces, stinging like shards of glass. Grace's frustration boiled over, her hands shaking as she fumbled a plank, sending it crashing to the ground. "This is impossible," she snapped, her voice raw. "I didn't ask for this, for any of this." The words spilled out, sharp and unbidden, fueled by days of silence and the weight of a life she hadn't chosen. Caleb paused, his hammer poised, his eyes meeting hers through the swirling snow. "Neither did I," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying a truth that silenced her. For a moment they stood frozen, the storm raging around them, their shared burdens laid bare. He turned back to the roof, his movements deliberate, and Grace swallowed her anger, picking up another plank. They worked until their hands bled, the roof patched with crude but stubborn resolve, a testament to their uneasy alliance. Inside, the cabin was no warmer, the fire struggling against the cold that seeped through the walls. Grace's hands throbbed, her knuckles raw from the hammer's recoil, and she winced as she tried to flex them. Caleb noticed, his gaze sharpening, and the storm came without warning, a beast of ice and fury that descended on the cabin like a curse. The wind howled, no longer content to rattle the shutters but tearing at them, as if seeking entry to claim what warmth remained. Grace Hamilton woke to the sound of dripping water, a steady plink against the floorboards, and saw the roof sagging under a weight it could not bear. Ice coated the window in a crystalline shroud, the world beyond reduced to a gray blur. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, its light barely reaching the walls, and the cold seeped through every crack, curling around her like a predator. She pulled her shawl tighter, her breath visible in the dimness, and glanced at Caleb Mason, who was already at the door, his coat buttoned against the onslaught. His face was grim, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, and Grace knew this was no ordinary storm. "We need to brace the roof," he said, his voice cutting through the wind's wail. "It'll collapse if we don't." He handed her a hammer, its handle worn smooth, and gestured to a pile of wooden planks by the wall. Grace hesitated, her hands unaccustomed to such tools, but the urgency in his eyes left no room for argument. She followed him outside, the cold hitting her like a fist, stealing her breath. The clearing was a battlefield of ice, the trees bowing under glittering weight, their branches snapping with sharp cracks that echoed like gunfire. The roof was a patchwork of frost and splintered wood, a gaping hole where the storm had clawed through. They worked in silence, their movements frantic yet precise. Driven by the storm's relentless assault, Grace's fingers numbed as she held planks in place, her nails catching on rough edges, her skirts heavy with ice. Caleb hammered nails with steady blows, his breath clouding the air, but the wind fought them at every turn, flinging snow into their faces, stinging like shards of glass. A splinter pierced Grace's palm, sharp and sudden, and she bit back a cry, her frustration boiling over. "This isn't what I wanted," she snapped, the words escaping before she could stop them. "None of this. Marriage, this cabin, this life." Her voice trembled, raw with the weight of dreams buried under snow and scandal. Caleb paused, his hammer poised, his eyes meeting hers through the flurry. "You think I chose this?" he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the wind's howl. "I didn't ask for a wife, or for you to fall into my life. But here we are, and we're all we've got." His words were blunt, but there was no anger in them, only a weary truth that stung more than the cold. Grace looked away, her cheeks burning, shame mixing with defiance. She wanted to argue, to scream at the unfairness of it all, but the roof groaned above them, a reminder of the stakes, and she swallowed her words, gripping the plank tighter. They finished as dawn broke, the storm easing to a sullen murmur. The roof held, patched and uneven, a testament to their fragile alliance. Back inside, Grace's hands shook as she warmed them by the fire, the splinter's sting now a throbbing ache. Caleb noticed, his brow furrowing, and without a word, he fetched a strip of cloth and a tin of salve. He knelt before her, his touch gentle as he cleaned the wound, his scarred fingers steady against her trembling ones. "You did good out there," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Not many could have kept up. Grace met his eyes, surprised by the warmth in them, and for a moment the cabin felt less like a prison. The fire's glow a bridge between their silences. The door creaked open, admitting a gust of icy air and Amos, the rival hunter, his smirk as sharp as the knife at his belt. "Heard you had trouble, Mason," he said, his eyes flicking to Grace, lingering too long. "Roof's not the only thing falling apart, eh? Married life suits you poorly." Caleb's jaw tightened, his hand pausing on the cloth, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Get out, Amos," he said, his voice deadly calm. Amos chuckled, tossing a broken trap onto the floor, a deliberate taunt, before sauntering out, his laughter swallowed by the wind. Grace's heart raced, the air thick with unspoken tension. Caleb finished bandaging her hand, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. "He's trouble," he said, his eyes distant, "but he's not worth it." Grace nodded, her fingers brushing the bandage, the warmth of his care seeping deeper than the salve. As the fire crackled, casting their shadows on the walls, she felt a shift, subtle but undeniable. A thread of trust weaving through the cracks of their makeshift life. Outside, the ice glittered under the rising sun, a fleeting beauty born of the storm's wrath, and Grace wondered if they, too, could find something enduring in their shared struggle. The cabin's fire burned low, its embers casting a feeble glow that barely reached the walls, as if reluctant to challenge the winter's dominion. Grace Hamilton sat at the rough-hewn table, her fingers tracing the edges of a letter, its paper creased and smudged from a journey through snow and mistrust. The words, penned in her father's unsteady hand, were a weight she couldn't shake, each line a tether pulling her back to the town she'd fled. Outside, the wind moaned, a restless spirit rattling the shutters, and the silence within the cabin was a fragile thing, stretched taut between her and Caleb Mason. He stood by the door, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, his movements precise but his eyes distant, as if sensing the storm brewing in her heart. Grace folded the letter, tucking it into her apron, but its words lingered like a bruise. The trading post was failing, the townsfolk's boycott a punishment for her scandal, and her father needed her back. She had found the letter that morning, delivered by a reluctant boy from town who'd braved the drifts for a coin. "Dear Grace," it began, "the store cannot hold. Mrs. Wheeler's flock shuns us, and debts mount like snow. Come home, child. We need you." The plea was a knife, cutting through the fragile peace she'd built in the cabin. She thought of her father's ledger, its pages filled with dwindling figures, and the bar's laughter, now silenced by the town's wrath. Her absence had cost him dearly, and guilt gnawed at her, sharp as the cold seeping through the floorboards. Yet the thought of returning, to Mrs. Margaret's venom, to whispers that branded her, made her stomach churn. And Caleb, this stranger she called husband, what would he say to her leaving? The door burst open, admitting a gust of icy air, and Ethan Hamilton, Grace's older brother, his face flushed from the cold and something fiercer, his coat was dusted with snow, his eyes blazing as they landed on Caleb. "So this is where you've dragged my sister," he said, his voice sharp with accusation. "A shack in the wilderness, with a man who can't even keep his traps full." Grace stood, her heart racing, but Ethan's gaze softened as it turned to her, though it carried a weight of its own. "Grace, pause in trouble," You need to come back. Caleb set the rifle down, his movements slow, deliberate, but his jaw tightened, a storm brewing beneath his calm. She's my wife now, he said, his voice low but unyielding. This is her home. The words were a claim, but Grace heard the strain in them, the echo of a man unused to such ties. Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched, and for a moment she feared they might come to blows. Stop it, both of you, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Ethan, I know about the store. I'll help, but not like this. She turned to Caleb, her eyes pleading for understanding, but his face was a mask, his thoughts hidden behind a wall she couldn't breach. Ethan's shoulders slumped, but his voice was bitter. You deserve better than this, Grace, he said, and left as abruptly as he'd come, the door slamming in his wake. That night Grace lay awake, the letter's words haunting her. She rose quietly, retrieving a small velvet pouch from her trunk, a silver bracelet, a gift from her mother, its delicate chain her last tie to a softer past. She could sell it, send the money to her father, and ease his burden without abandoning Caleb. The plan formed in secret, a desperate act to balance her divided loyalties. But as she slipped the pouch into her apron, Caleb's voice cut through the darkness. What are you hiding, Grace? She froze, the pouch heavy in her hand, and turned to find him standing by the fire, his eyes sharp with hurt. I wasn't, she began, but the lie died on her lips. She pulled out the bracelet, its silver glinting in the firelight. It's for Pa, she said, her voice breaking. The store's failing because of me. I thought I could help without telling you. Caleb's face softened, though the pain lingered in his eyes. You don't trust me, he said, not a question but a wound laid bare. Grace shook her head, tears welling. It's not that I didn't want to burden you. You've done enough. She stepped closer, the bracelet between them, a fragile offering. I'm trying to hold on to them, and to this. He took the bracelet, his fingers brushing hers, and studied it in silence. Keep it, he said finally, handing it back, or we'll find another way, together. The word was a promise, small but steady, and Grace felt its warmth seep into her, stronger than the fire's glow. As they sat by the hearth, the letter's weight lifted, if only slightly, and the cabin felt less like a cage, more like a place where trust might grow. Outside, the wind carried Ethan's words away, but within these walls, Grace and Caleb took a tentative step toward something new, their shadows merging in the flickering light. The forest was a cathedral of ice, its trees draped in frost, their branches glistening under a moon that bled silver through the clouds. Grace Hamilton moved cautiously through the snow, her arms laden with firewood, each step a crunch that echoed in the stillness. The cold bit through her gloves, numbing her fingers, but the cabin's dwindling woodpile had driven her out, a necessity that outweighed her fear. The wind was quiet tonight, a deceptive calm, and the only sound was her breath, sharp and uneven, as she scanned the shadows. Caleb was in the cabin, cleaning his traps, his silence a constant companion, but their shared moments, his gentle touch when bandaging her hand, their talk by the fire, had kindled a fragile trust, a warmth she carried into the dark. The garden seeds, buried beneath snow, were her anchor, a promise of spring she clung to, even as winter's grip tightened. A low growl shattered the silence, stopping her heart. She froze, the firewood slipping from her arms, scattering across the snow. 3 shapes emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing like embers, their teeth bared in hunger. Wolves, lean and desperate, their fur matted with frost, circled her, their paws silent on the snow. Grace's pulse thundered, her breath catching as she backed toward a tree, its bark rough against her spine. The lead wolf snarled, its breath steaming, and she clutched a branch, her hands trembling, knowing it was no match for their jaws. Her mind flashed to the trading post, to Sarah's smile, to the primer's pages she might never teach. Fear clawed at her, but beneath it a spark of defiance flared. She would not die here. A gunshot cracked through the night, sharp and final, and the wolves scattered, their howls fading into the forest. Caleb burst through the trees, his rifle still raised, his face etched with urgency. His eyes locked on Grace, scanning her for harm, and he lowered the gun, his breath ragged. You all right? He asked, his voice rough but steady, a lifeline in the chaos. Grace nodded, her legs weak, and stumbled toward him, the branch falling from her grip. He caught her arm, his touch firm, grounding, and for a moment the forest's threat receded, the moonlight painting them in silver. Before they could speak, a new sound broke the silence, boots crunching, voices low and menacing. 4 men emerged from the shadows, their faces weathered, their eyes glinting with greed. Amos, the rival hunter, led them, his smirk sharp as a blade, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Well, Mason," he drawled, his gaze flicking to Grace. "Seems your luck's run dry. No game, no traps, and now wolves sniffing around. Hand over your stores or we'll take 'em ourselves." His companions chuckled, their hands resting on knives, their intent clear in the moonlight. Caleb stepped in front of Grace, his rifle raised, his voice cold as the snow. "You're on my land, Amos. Leave or you won't walk away." The air crackled with tension. The men shifting, their eyes darting between Caleb and the cabin. Grace's heart raced, but an idea sparked. She sank to her knees, clutching her ankle, her voice trembling as she gasped. "It's broken. Please." The act was convincing, her face pale from the wolf attack, and Amos hesitated, his smirk faltering. "Deal with her later," he muttered to his men, turning back to Caleb. It was the opening they needed. Caleb fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing like thunder, and the men flinched, their bravado crumbling. "Next one's for you," Caleb said, his aim steady, his eyes unyielding. Grace scrambled to her feet, grabbing a fallen branch, ready to swing if needed. Amos cursed, his men backing away, and he spat into the snow. "This ain't over, Mason," he snarled, retreating with his crew, their shadows swallowed by the forest. The silence that followed was deafening, the moon's light stark against the snow. Grace's legs gave way, and she sank to the ground, her breath shuddering. Caleb knelt beside her, his rifle set aside, his hands hovering as if unsure where to land. "You're safe," he said, his voice softer now, almost a vow. Grace met his eyes, seeing not just the hunter who had faced wolves and men, but a man who stood between her and the world's cruelty. She reached for him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, and he held her, his embrace steady, warm against the cold. The firewood lay scattered, forgotten, but in that moment they were enough. Two souls bound by survival, their hearts beating as one. As they gathered the wood and returned to the cabin, the fire's glow welcomed them, a beacon in the dark. Grace's hand brushed Caleb's, a fleeting touch that carried the weight of their shared triumph. The wolves' howls echoed faintly, a reminder of the dangers beyond. But within these walls, a bond was forming, fragile but fierce, like a seed pushing through frozen earth. The conference hall squatted at the heart of the town, its weathered planks groaning under the weight of a community gathered to pass judgment. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lamp oil and damp wool, the flickering light casting long shadows that danced like specters across the walls. Grace Hamilton stood at the back, her hands clasped tightly to still their trembling, her cloak heavy with the chill of the evening. Caleb Mason stood beside her, his presence a silent bulwark, his jaw set against the murmurs that swirled around them. The pews were filled with familiar faces, shopkeepers, farmers, women in starched bonnets, each pair of eyes ablade, sharpened by the scandal that had branded Grace a sinner. Mrs. Margaret Wheeler presided from the front, her black bonnet a crown of righteousness, her voice ringing with the authority of a judge in a court of whispers. "This meeting, Mrs. Margaret declared, her words slicing through the restless hum, addresses a matter of moral decay. Grace Hamilton and Caleb Mason have brought shame upon us, their actions a blight on our community's soul." She gestured toward them, her eyes cold as the frost outside, and the crowd's murmurs swelled, a tide of condemnation. Grace felt her cheeks burn, the memory of the cabin's warmth fading under the weight of their stares. She thought of the wolves, the thieves, the storms they'd faced together, and straightened, her fear hardening into resolve. She would not let this town rewrite her story. "Mrs. Margaret continued, her voice a litany of accusations. The night in the cabin, the defiance of decency, the stain on the town's honor. Each word was a stone, piling higher, and Grace felt Caleb's hand brush hers, a fleeting touch that steadied her. She glanced at him, his face unreadable but his eyes fierce, a silent vow to weather this storm as they had the last. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably, their faces caught between duty and doubt. Sarah, seated near the edge, met Grace's gaze, her freckled face pale but resolute, her hands twisting in her lap. "I will speak," Grace said, her voice trembling but clear, cutting through the din. The room fell silent, eyes widening as she stepped forward, her heart pounding like a drum. "You judge me for a night I didn't choose, for a storm that nearly took my life. Caleb saved me, and you call it sin. Where is your mercy?" Her words echoed, raw and unpolished, but they carried the weight of truth. She thought of her father's ledger, Sarah's primer, the garden struggling under snow, each a piece of her fight to survive. "I've done no wrong," she said, her voice steadier now, "but you've made me a prisoner of your whispers." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces softening, others hardening. Sarah stood, her voice quavering but firm. "Grace is no sinner," she said, her eyes darting to Mrs. Margaret, then back to the crowd. "She's braver than any of you know. Stop this." Her words were a spark, igniting whispers of agreement, but Mrs. Margaret's glare silenced them, her voice sharp as a whip. "Enough," she snapped. "This is not a debate. Their marriage does not erase the scandal." She turned to Grace, her eyes glittering with triumph. "You will never be one of us again." Before Grace could respond, Tom Larson rose, his broad frame commanding attention. "There's another way," he said, his voice earnest, his eyes fixed on Grace. "You don't have to stay with him, Grace. Come back, start over. I'll help you." His words were a plea, but they carried a sting, a reminder of a life she might have had, now twisted by his assumption. Grace's throat tightened, her resolve wavering under the weight of his gaze. Caleb stepped forward, his hand finding hers, his grip firm and unyielding. "She's my wife," he said, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the room like a blade. "Not because of your rules, but because I choose her. Judge us if you want, but we're done with your chains." His eyes met Grace's, and in them she saw not just defiance but something deeper, a commitment forged in snow and fire, wolves and thieves. The crowd fell silent, Mrs. Margaret's lips pursing, her authority shaken. The meeting ended in a flurry of murmurs, some hostile, others uncertain. Mrs. Margaret swept out, vowing to uphold the boycott, but Sarah's nod and the softened faces of a few townsfolk lingered in Grace's mind. As they left the hall, Caleb's hand remained in hers, a quiet strength against the cold. The stars burned bright above, indifferent to the town's verdict, and Grace felt a fire kindling within her, fueled by Caleb's words and her own defiance. They were bound, not by duty, but by a choice they were beginning to make together, a fragile hope in a world that offered none. The night was still, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath, broken only by the soft crackle of the cabin's fire. Grace Hamilton knelt by her garden, her fingers brushing the frozen earth where she'd planted seeds, now buried under a thin crust of snow. The fire's glow spilled through the window, casting her shadow long and wavering, a silent partner in her vigil. Inside, Caleb Mason sat by the hearth, sharpening his knife, his movements steady but his eyes distant, as if tethered to memories she couldn't reach. Their shared trials, wolves, thieves, the town's judgment, had woven a fragile bond, yet the weight of their past lingered, heavy as the winter air. Grace stood, wiping her hands, and turned toward the cabin, unaware of the spark that had escaped the chimney. A tiny ember drifting on the wind, hungry for fuel. A sharp crack broke the silence, followed by the acrid scent of smoke. Grace spun, her heart lurching as she saw flames licking the edge of her garden, the dry grass catching like tinder. The fire was small but fierce, its orange tongues devouring the earth she'd tended with such care. "Caleb!" she shouted, her voice piercing the night, and he was at her side in an instant, his face pale as he took in the sight. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts, and Grace saw terror in his eyes, raw and unmasked. She remembered his words about the hovel, the fire that had stolen his family, and understood his paralysis, the past roaring back like a beast unchained. "We have to stop it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. She grabbed a blanket from the porch, beating at the flames, her arms aching with each swing. Caleb stood frozen, his breath shallow, the fire's glow reflecting in his eyes like a nightmare reborn. "Caleb, help me!" Grace's shout snapped him back, and he seized a bucket, scooping snow to douse the flames. They worked in frantic rhythm, Grace's blanket smothering the fire's edges, Caleb's snow quenching its heart. Smoke stung her eyes, the heat searing her hands, but she pressed on, her garden's survival a mirror to her own. The flames weakened, dying to embers, leaving a blackened scar where her seeds had lain. Grace sank to her knees, her breath ragged, the garden's ruin a weight on her heart. The earth was charred, her hopes reduced to ash, and tears pricked her eyes as she touched the scorched soil. Caleb knelt beside her, his hands trembling, his face etched with guilt. "I should have checked the chimney," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is my fault." Grace shook her head, her hand finding his, the warmth of his skin a contrast to the cold ground. "We stopped it," she said. "Together." The next morning, Caleb led her into the forest, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his steps purposeful. The trees were silent, their branches heavy with snow, but he found a clearing where wildflowers had once grown, their seeds hidden beneath the frost. They gathered what they could, their fingers numb but determined, and returned to the cabin to replant. The blackened earth resisted, but Grace worked with quiet resolve, each seed a defiance against despair. Caleb watched, his silence softer now, a shared understanding in his gaze. As they cleared the ashes, Grace found a small, singed cloth, the handkerchief of Caleb's sister, its blue flowers faded but intact. She cleaned it carefully, her needle threading new life into its worn edges, and that evening she pressed it into Caleb's hands. "For you," she said, her voice soft, her eyes holding his. "She'd want you to have it." Caleb's fingers closed around the cloth, his throat working, and he pulled her close, his embrace a wordless gratitude that warmed her more than the fire. The cabin door creaked open, admitting Ethan Hamilton, his face no longer sharp with anger but softened by regret. "I was wrong," he said, his eyes on Caleb, then Grace. "About you, about this place." He carried a sack of tools, offering to help rebuild the garden's border, his hands joining theirs in the cold earth. The work was slow, the ground unyielding, but as they labored, Grace felt the weight of her brother's judgment lift, replaced by a tentative peace. The garden, though scarred, held new seeds, and the cabin, once a prison, felt like a home taking shape. Caleb's hand brushed hers as they planted, a quiet promise, and Grace knew that, like the earth beneath them, they were rebuilding something stronger, something that could endure the winter's wrath. The first breath of spring whispered through the clearing, a timid warmth that softened the snow's edges and stirred the earth beneath. Grace Hamilton knelt in her garden, her hands cradling a sapling, its roots delicate but stubborn, a promise of life in a world that had known too much cold. The cabin stood behind her, its weathered walls bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the smoke from its chimney curling like a prayer. Caleb Mason worked beside her, his scarred hands gentle as they pressed soil around the sapling, his silence no longer a wall but a space where their shared story grew. The trials of winter, storms, wolves, thieves the town's scorn, had forged them, not into the strangers bound by duty, but into partners who chose each other, their bond as resilient as the earth they tended. The garden, once a blackened scar, now bore faint green shoots, each a defiance against the fire that had nearly claimed it. Grace's fingers brushed the soil, her thoughts drifting to the primer hidden beneath her palette, its pages a dream she no longer saw as lost. She had begun teaching herself in stolen moments, reading by candlelight, and Caleb had watched, his quiet nods of support she hadn't expected. He had changed too, his guarded edges softening, his laughter rare but real, like sunlight breaking through clouds. She glanced at him, his face softened by the day's glow, and felt a warmth deeper than the spring's tentative touch, a certainty that this cabin, this man, was her home. Caleb stood, dusting his hands, and reached into his coat, pulling out a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her, his eyes steady, a flicker of vulnerability beneath their strength. Grace unwrapped it, revealing a wooden figurine, intricately carved to show two figures standing side by side, their hands entwined. The lines were simple but precise, capturing her braid, his broad shoulders, a testament to hours spent by the fire, his knife shaping their story. "For you," he said, his voice low, almost shy. "You brought light to this place, Grace. To me." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, and she clutched the figurine, its weight a promise heavier than any vow spoken in the church. That night, by the fire's glow, Grace opened her journal, the primer's lessons now joined by her own words. "This is home," she wrote, her pen steady, not because of walls or earth, but because of him. "Caleb, who saved me from the snow, from myself, and gave me a place to grow." She paused, her eyes drifting to him, asleep by the hearth, the lines of his face eased in rest. The town's whispers, Mrs. Margaret's venom, her father's pleas, they were distant now, echoes of a life she no longer needed. The garden, the sapling, the figurine, they were her truth, rooted in a love she hadn't foreseen. A letter arrived that morning, carried by a trader passing through, its wax seal bearing the name Jacob, a friend from Caleb's past. It spoke of opportunity, a trading venture in a distant town, a chance to build anew. Caleb read it in silence, his brow furrowed, and set it aside, his hand finding Grace's. "We'll decide together," he said, and she nodded. The future a path they would forge as one. The sapling stood outside, its leaves trembling in the breeze, and Grace felt its strength mirrored in her heart, a resilience born of shared struggle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, a cold wind swept through the clearing, sudden and sharp, rattling the cabin's shutters. It carried a whisper of winter's return, a reminder that the frontier was never tame, its challenges as enduring as the land itself. Grace and Caleb stood by the sapling, their hands entwined, their shadows merging in the fading light. They had faced storms and fire, wolves and men, and emerged stronger. But the wind's chill asked a question neither could answer. What trials lay ahead, and would their love be enough to meet them? The sapling stood alone in the twilight, its slender trunk swaying under the weight of a cold wind, a fragile sentinel in a world of ice and shadow. Grace and Caleb had planted it with hands worn by struggle, their love a quiet defiance against the frontier's cruelty. The cabin glowed behind them, a beacon of warmth, its fire a testament to the life they'd built from ashes. Yet the letter from Jacob lay on the table, its words a siren call to a future unknown. And the wind's howl carried a challenge, sharp as a blade. They had found each other in the storm, forged a bond through trial and trust, but the frontier cared little for such victories. As the stars emerged, cold and distant, the sapling trembled, a flicker of green in the gathering dark. Would it stand through the winter to come, or would the cold claim it, as it had so many dreams before?